Imagine walking across a perfectly flat parking lot.
Right. Just a completely level surface.
Exactly. There is no ice, there's no gravel, there isn't even, an uneven city sidewalk where a tree root has pushed up the concrete.
Nothing to trip over.
Right. It is a perfectly flat, structurally sound surface. And yet, for absolutely no discernible reason, you find yourself drifting to the left.
It's a terrifying moment for people.
It really is. And you casually adjust your trajectory, right? Perhaps blaming your clumsy feet or assuming your legs are just getting a bit tired as you age.
Which is what everyone assumes.
But what if I told you your legs are structurally flawless, and the real reason you just drifted is that your brain is actively, mechanically suffocating?
Wow. I mean, it is a terrifying biological reality that most of the modern medical establishment, frankly, completely misinterprets.
Completely.
We're looking at a progressive starvation of cerebral tissue, and it is happening in plain sight.
Welcome to this urgent medical deep dive. Look, as longevity specialists, we spend our entire lives analyzing the absolute bleeding edge of vascular health.
Neurodevelopment, cellular aging, all of it.
Right. We sift through thousands of clinical papers, but today we are setting aside our usual format because we have a highly specific, very critical mission.
Yes, we do.
We are analyzing an extensive body of clinical data provided by Dr. Leonard Brooks. He's a clinician with over 20 years of strictly targeted experience in complex neurological and musculoskeletal conditions.
And what his data reveals, I mean, it's a widely misdiagnosed, frankly, devastating health crisis, and it's affecting almost everyone over the age of 45.
It's staggering. So the mission of our discussion today is to thoroughly deconstruct a systemic diagnostic failure.
We absolutely have to dismantle this pervasive myth that subtle balance issues and the cascading cognitive decline that shadows them are just inevitable signs of cellular aging.
They aren't.
No, they are not the normal wear and tear of a biological clock winding down. They are direct, measurable, and observable symptoms of a mechanical starvation of the brain's oxygen supply.
What millions of people quietly accept as just getting older, what they resign themselves to as the fading of the light, it is actually a progressive but highly reversible brain circulation crisis.
Highly reversible. That's the key.
Okay, let's unpack this because the clinical data we are looking at from Dr. Brooks requires our absolute undivided attention. We really have to start at the point of failure.
The diagnostic illusion.
Right, the illusion that the body's hardware is what's breaking down.
Well, the deception lies in the symptom profile itself. The onset is so gradual, so incredibly insidious, that it just evades standard clinical detection entirely.
Because we aren't talking about massive events.
Exactly. We are not discussing dramatic, catastrophic events like collapsing down a flight of stairs. We are looking at micro failures in spatial navigation.
Drifting on flat surfaces is really just the beginning.
It is.
It's the moment you stand up from a dining room chair, maybe just a fraction too quickly, and your hand reaches out to graze the wall.
Or you grab the back of the chair to steady yourself.
Right, and you don't even consciously register the action. It just becomes this deeply ingrained habit.
And then there are the micro hesitations.
Yes. This is the detail in Dr. Brooks's notes that truly gave me pause.
It's chilling.
It is. Your body is in fluid motion. You approach a corner or a doorway, and there is a split second where your physical frame just halts.
A literal neurological stutter.
Exactly, a neurological stutter before the body decides which direction it is actually going to take.
And consider the compounding tragedy of what happens when a patient finally gathers the concern to bring this up to their primary care physician.
Oh, it's so frustrating.
It is. They endure this 5-minute consultation that inevitably ends with the doctor glancing up from a tablet and offering empty platitudes.
Watch your step.
Right. Or maybe look into some light balance exercises. Or, and this is the worst one, they deploy the most fatalistic, destructive phrase in the modern medical lexicon.
Well, it's just your age.
Yes. It's just your age.
I mean, it leaves the patient feeling like a passive, entirely helpless victim of time.
Which is fundamentally untrue.
To illustrate the profound danger of treating surface symptoms without understanding the underlying vascular mechanisms, Dr. Brooks presents a clinical scenario that perfectly isolates this diagnostic failure.
The three wobblers analogy.
Yes, the three wobblers. Imagine 3 individuals standing in a room and all 3 are visibly wobbling.
Completely unable to maintain a linear walking path.
Right. The clinical presentation is identical across the board. The first individual is a stroke survivor who has just just been discharged from a neurology ward.
Okay.
The second is an intoxicated man at a 4th of July backyard party attempting to walk across the lawn.
Sure.
And the third is a 14-month-old girl taking her very first highly uncoordinated steps.
All three drift. All three stumble. All three reach out desperately for physical support to arrest their fall.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is that while all three of those individuals exhibit the exact same physical stumbling, treating them with the same clinical intervention would be outright medical malpractice.
100%.
Because the underlying mechanisms are entirely different. The stroke survivor has suffered acute necrotic tissue damage in the brain due to an infarction or hemorrhage.
Right. Physical brain damage.
Exactly. The intoxicated man is experiencing temporary chemical suppression of his neural pathways via ethanol binding to GABA receptors.
Chemical interference.
Yes. And the infant is in the nascent stages of primary myelin sheath development and neural mapping.
So they are learning the pathways.
Exactly. The outward symptom is identical. The internal biological mechanism is entirely different.
And this is exactly where the patient's instinct leads them off a cliff.
Because they focus on the symptom.
Right. A patient starts drifting in a parking lot, and their immediate logical assumption is structural weakness.
They think their legs are failing them.
Yes. So they begin a regimen of squats. They load up on calcium and magnesium supplements to fortify their bones.
They spend hours watching videos on ankle stability and kinetic chains.
Which what we have to violently push back on. Treating your legs for this specific type of balance issue is, it's like trying to rebuild the tires, the suspension, and the transmission of a high-performance vehicle when the steering column's internal computer is fundamentally fried.
It's completely counterproductive.
Your legs are a biological miracle. They really are. They are the refined result of millions of years of evolutionary bipedal engineering, but they are just hardware.
Hardware, no matter how biologically sophisticated, no matter the density of the bone or the contractile force of the muscle fibers, is entirely useless without the command center.
Right.
The brain must tell the hardware exactly what to do, at what precise millisecond, and with precisely how much force.
Which forces us to look at the biomechanics of human bipedalism itself. We have to examine the concept of the controlled fall.
And the reality is cerebellar starvation.
Right, because we take walking entirely for granted. We view it as a stable, inherently grounded activity.
But our perception of walking is a neurological illusion.
A complete illusion.
When you strip away the subjective experience and look purely at the biomechanical physics, human bipedal locomotion is shockingly precarious.
It's basically a miracle we stay upright.
It is. Walking is not a smooth, mechanically secure process. At its fundamental core, walking is a continuous, highly controlled fall.
And that isn't a metaphor. That is the literal mechanical definition of the movement.
Exactly. Every single time you initiate a step, you are triggering a massive kinetic chain of events.
You push off with the rear foot.
And in doing so, you deliberately shift your center of mass ahead of your base of support. For a measurable fraction of a second, you are entirely in a state of gravitational freefall.
Which is terrifying when you really think about it.
The Earth is pulling your mass downward, and there is absolutely nothing beneath you to arrest that momentum.
So the swinging leg has to come forward and strike the ground at the exact perfect microsecond to catch the weight of your falling body.
Yes.
If that timing is off by a fraction of a second, you stumble.
If it's consistently off by just a hair, you drift sideways.
Right. And if the timing degrades beyond a critical threshold, you impact the ground.
The neurological processing power demanded by that timing is staggering.
It's immense.
The structure responsible for managing this impossible calculus is the cerebellum, which is nestled at the base of the skull.
Okay.
Every fraction of a second, the cerebellum is ingesting an overwhelming deluge of real-time data streams.
From everywhere in the body.
Yes. It processes proprioceptive feedback from the mechanoreceptors in your joints. It analyzes vestibular data regarding fluid dynamics in your inner ears.
It processes spatial mapping from the visual cortex.
Exactly. It synthesizes all of this simultaneously, calculates your trajectory against the constant force of gravity, and fires millions of microcorrections down your spinal cord to your motor neurons.
And the metabolic cost of that computing power is almost incomprehensible.
It's been massive.
The brain accounts for roughly 2% of total body weight, but it ruthlessly, non-negotiably demands 20% of the body's entire oxygen and glucose supply.
It is the most metabolically expensive machinery we know of.
By far.
But that extreme metabolic demand is precisely its vulnerability.
Right.
Because the cerebellum is so desperate for constant ATP production, it is extraordinarily sensitive to any fluctuation in oxygen delivery.
Which brings us to a huge misconception in modern neurology.
The idea that you need a catastrophic event, like a massive ischemic stroke, to cause measurable functional damage.
Right. People think if they haven't had a stroke, their brain blood flow is fine.
But the reality is far more insidious. A modest chronic reduction in blood flow, a slow, quiet, mechanical restriction of oxygen over months or years is more than enough to degrade the cerebellum's capacity to manage that millisecond timing.
And when that slow starvation begins, the brain doesn't just shut down all at once.
No, it performs a brutal biological triage.
Right. It starts making compromises, sacrificing specific functions to keep the core survival systems online.
Which leads us to the broader systemic warning signs.
When I reviewed this section of Dr. Brooks's clinical data, the connections were chilling.
They really are.
These are symptoms people joke about. They are the punchlines of dinner party conversations about getting older, completely devoid of the realization that their brain is mechanically suffocating.
We are looking at a hidden symptom cluster. These systemic signs almost universally accompany the physical balance issues, but they are rarely connected by diagnosticians.
Because modern medicine has overly compartmentalized the human body.
Exactly. The neurologist analyzes the brain, the orthopedist examines the cervical spine, the general practitioner reviews the blood work, and the systemic interconnected crisis slips entirely through the cracks.
Let's examine the first major systemic warning sign: short-term memory evaporation.
This is a big one.
And I am not talking about general absent-mindedness. I am talking about the specific phenomenon of walking from your living room into your kitchen, and by the time your foot crosses the threshold, the entire purpose of your journey is gone.
Completely erased.
Yes. Or you start a sentence with absolute clarity, and halfway through the articulation, the core noun simply vanishes from your cognitive grasp.
The biological mechanism driving this is critical to understand.
Go ahead.
Short-term memory formation. The literal act of taking a present, real-time experience and encoding it into your neural circuitry requires massive amounts of ATP.
So it's highly energy intensive.
Incredibly so. When cerebral blood flow drops, the brain must conserve energy. It abandons the most metabolically expensive non-lethal processes first.
And short-term memory encoding is always the early casualty of oxygen starvation.
Always.
But I have to push back on this mechanism just a bit because it's the exact point of confusion for so many patients. Why does the brain allow a patient to vividly, perfectly recall a specific Tuesday afternoon from 20 years ago? The exact weather, the clothing they were wearing, the conversation they had, but it completely blanks on a sentence they initiated 5 seconds ago.
Right.
How does that selective amnesia make biological sense?
It comes down to the thermodynamics of neural architecture. Forming a new memory requires real-time neurogenesis and the firing of entirely new synaptic pathways in the hippocampus.
Okay, so building new structures.
Yes, that physical construction of new neural bridges requires a massive surge of oxygenated blood.
I see.
Accessing a memory from 20 years ago, however, is merely opening a heavily fortified archived file.
The pathway's already there.
Exactly. The neural pathway is already paved, myelinated, and reinforced. It takes a fraction of the metabolic energy to send an electrical impulse down an established pathway compared to encoding new data.
Wow.
So the brain permits you to reminisce about 2 decades ago because it's cheap, but it literally cannot afford the biological cost of remembering why you opened the refrigerator.
That makes terrifying sense. And if the brain's energy budget is constantly being mismanaged just to keep the core systems online, what happens when the tank finally hits empty?
You crash.
Right. Which manifests as the second warning sign, the scheduled fatigue wall.
This is so common.
We are talking about a patient hitting an absolute impenetrable physical and mental wall at 2.0 or 2.30 in the afternoon.
Like clockwork.
And to be clear, this occurs despite the patient securing a full 8 hours of quality sleep the night before.
This phenomenon is profoundly misunderstood in clinical settings.
How so?
Well, when a patient reports this severe afternoon collapse, the immediate medical reflex is to evaluate sleep hygiene. They screen for sleep apnea or look for circadian rhythm disruptions.
But that's missing the point entirely.
Exactly. If the patient is resting adequately, this 2.00 p.m. wall is not a sleep deficit. It is a sheer energy delivery failure.
The brain has been operating on a restricted, compromised oxygen budget since the moment they woke up.
Right. And by early afternoon, the cellular energy reserves within the mitochondria are entirely depleted.
So the engine hasn't failed, the fuel line is pinched.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which brings us to the third systemic warning: clinical brain fog. And Dr. Brooks defines this with unsettling precision.
He really does.
It is not generalized tiredness. It is a specific, measurable, half-second processing delay.
Right.
One patient articulated it as trying to read a complex document through a foggy windshield. The cognitive friction is immense. The words are visually processed, but the comprehension lags.
That subjective experience of cognitive friction is the literal slowing of neural conduction velocity.
Slower signals.
Yes. Because the neurons lack optimal oxygen saturation, the electrical impulses literally travel slower across these synaptic clefts.
So the hardware is intact, but the signal transmission is degraded.
Exactly.
We really need to ground this theoretical framework in reality. Let's look at the case study Dr. Brooks provided regarding Robert.
Robert's case is fascinating.
It is. Robert is a 64-year-old civil engineer from Denver. Because of his engineering background, he is incredibly methodical.
Highly analytical.
Right. He has meticulously tracked his own blood pressure and heart rate variability every morning for a decade. He is highly attuned to minor fluctuations in his own biological data.
Which is rare for most patients.
Very rare. So he presents to the clinic because he notices a consistent drift to the left when walking. Furthermore, he is experiencing a terrifying inability to recall proper nouns.
The names of colleagues he has worked alongside for years just gone.
Yes. And he is slamming into that severe fatigue wall precisely at 2:00 p.m. every day.
And then there's the driving issue.
Right. Most alarmingly, he has voluntarily surrendered his keys and stopped driving at night because his processing speed has dropped so significantly he can no longer track multiple moving variables like headlights, pedestrians, and traffic signals simultaneously.
And the response from his primary care physician is highly illustrative of the systemic failure we are discussing.
What happened?
The physician performed standard due diligence. He ordered a comprehensive MRI of Robert's brain,
Okay, sounds reasonable.
and the imaging came back entirely clear. No tumors, no lesions, no ischemic strokes, no advanced cortical thinning.
Wow.
Based on that scan, Robert was dismissed and told he was simply experiencing the natural aging process.
But the imaging completely missed the etiology of the disease.
Completely.
How does an advanced multi-million-dollar magnetic resonance imaging machine miss a brain that is actively being starved of oxygen?
Because a standard MRI is a static structural photograph.
Oh, I see.
It captures the anatomy while the patient is lying perfectly motionless on their back inside a tube.
Right.
It provides absolutely no data on dynamic hemodynamics, how the blood actually flows while the patient is upright, moving, and under the mechanical stress of gravity and posture.
So Robert's cerebellum was not diseased in a way that static structural imaging could detect.
No, it wasn't.
It was being mechanically choked off from its fuel source. Here's where it gets really interesting. To understand how that choke point occurs, we have to examine an anatomical design flaw in the human body that seems almost unbelievable.
We really do.
We have to map out exactly how blood travels to the cerebellum.
We are analyzing the vertebrobasilar circulation.
Okay.
Visualize the anatomy of the cervical spine. Most major arteries in the human body, such as the carotid arteries situated in the anterior neck, run through relatively pliable soft tissue.
So they can move around a bit.
Exactly. They can expand, contract, and shift. The two vertebral arteries in the posterior neck, however, are entirely unique. They do not run alongside the cervical spine.
They run directly through it.
Yes.
They thread through tiny holes in the bone itself, the transverse foramen.
It's structurally bizarre.
Think of the vulnerability of that design. It is the equivalent of running a delicate, vital, fiber optic cable through a stacked column of shifting, jagged gears.
They ascend sequentially through the cervical vertebrae. And then at the very apex of the spine, they face a massive architectural hurdle.
Right at the top of the neck.
Yes. They must wrap entirely around the atlas, the C1 vertebra that supports the skull, execute a sharp, convoluted turn, and enter the base of the skull.
Wow.
Once inside, these two distinct arteries merge into one massive vessel known as the basilar artery.
And that single basilar artery is the absolute lifeline for the entire posterior brain.
Yes.
The cerebellum, the brain stem, the complex balance centers, the visual processing cortex. Every single one of those energy-hungry systems relies entirely on the blood flow from those two arteries threading through moving bone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, This specific architectural reality makes the vertebrobasilar system the most structurally vulnerable major circulation in the entire human body.
It is a mechanical disaster waiting to happen.
It really is.
Consider the biomechanics of modern human existence. We spend decades sitting in ergonomic nightmares staring at screens.
Developing severe forward head posture.
Right, where the heavy skull is thrust forward off its center of gravity. We carry old, unresolved whiplash microtraumas from minor car accidents decades ago.
And this relentless mechanical stress causes the deep stabilizing muscles of the cervical spine to lock into chronic spasm.
The vertebrae themselves begin to misalign under the uneven load.
And because the vertebral artery is literally trapped inside the bone, when the bone shifts and the muscles clamp down, the artery is compressed.
The internal diameter of the vessel is physically narrowed.
Exactly. And we are not talking about a total occlusion here.
Right, because a complete blockage would result in a massive brainstem stroke and immediate collapse.
We are talking about partial occlusion, a 10, 15, or 20% reduction in the internal diameter of the vessel.
But when you multiply that slight restriction over millions of heartbeats, day after day, year after year,
It creates a chronic, devastating starvation of the cerebellum.
The profound tragedy here is how patients attempt to self-correct when they feel that agonizing stiffness and tension in their neck.
They try to stretch it out.
Yes, they stretch. But they utilize standard archaic stretching techniques that actively exacerbate the vascular compression.
It's terrifying.
I am deeply concerned by the conventional advice to simply drop the chin to the chest or yank the ear toward the shoulder to relieve neck tension.
Those generalized stretches almost exclusively target the C5 and C6 vertebrae, which are located right in the middle of the cervical spine.
Okay.
Biomechanically, that region is already the most hypermobile segment of the neck. It constantly bears the shifting weight of the head.
So it already moves too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you aggressively force a stretch into that area, you're simply adding dangerous, destabilizing mobility to a joint complex that is already hypermobile.
While completely ignoring the deeply rigid, locked down areas that are actually compressing the vertebral arteries.
Precisely.
So if yanking on the middle of the neck is dangerous, where are the true restriction zones? Where is the fiber optic cable actually being crushed by the gears?
Dr. Brooks's data isolates two highly specific anatomical culprits.
Let's go through them.
The first is the cervicothoracic junction. This is the exact baseline of the neck, where the flexible cervical spine meets the rigid upper back. In countless patients over 45, this manifests visually as a dowager's hump.
Right, the bump at the base of the neck.
Yes, and we must dispel a major medical myth right now, that prominence is not merely a cosmetic accumulation of adipose tissue.
It's not just fat.
No. It is a region of profound, chronic mechanical blockage. The lower cervical vertebrae and upper thoracic vertebrae have essentially cemented themselves into a rigid, flexed forward position.
Wow.
This intense structural deviation forces the vertebral arteries to navigate a severe, restrictive detour before they can even begin their ascent to the brain.
And the second major choke point.
The upper cervical spine, specifically the articulation between C1 and C2, right at the base of the skull.
Where they make that sharp turn.
Exactly. This is where the vertebral arteries must execute their final vulnerable turn before entering the foramen magnum.
So any issue there is catastrophic.
Any asymmetrical muscular tension, any minor vertebral rotation in this complex creates an immediate, direct shearing compression on the blood flow to the cerebellum.
So we have mapped a terrifying reality. A mechanically starved brain, cascading symptoms of cognitive and physical decline, and a medical diagnostic system that is essentially taking an X-ray of the plumbing hardware while completely ignoring the severe drop in water pressure.
It's a profound systemic failure.
We must transition immediately into the solution. We are going to deconstruct Protocol Block 1, releasing the mechanical chokehold.
This is the exact step-by-step clinical intervention Dr. Brooks utilizes to mechanically restore the hemodynamics of the cervical spine.
To unkink the vertebral arteries.
Yes.
Exercise 1 is the C7 rotational release. And the precision of locating the target is paramount here, right?
Absolutely. You cannot execute this broadly.
Okay.
To isolate the C7 vertebra, the vertebral prominence, you must gently drop your chin toward your chest to expose the spinal column.
Okay, so dropping the chin down.
Reach behind your neck and trace the bone downward. At the very base of the neck, your fingers will encounter a bony prominence that protrudes significantly further than the surrounding structures.
That's C7.
That is the spinous process of C7.
You take the firm pad of your finger and press laterally against the side of that specific bony process,
Right.
and then you initiate a slow, highly controlled rotation of the head.
While maintaining firm, continuous pressure with the finger in the exact direction of the rotation.
Okay.
The biological target here is not the gross musculature. It is the deep joint capsule itself. As you rotate, you will encounter a mild elastic resistance.
Dr. Brooks's clinical notes describe this sensation as pressing against a taut rubber band.
Yes. And this is the critical failure point for most patients. You absolutely must not force the rotation past that resistance.
Why not?
That taut feeling is the physiological end range of the joint. If you aggressively push past it, the central nervous system will perceive a threat and trigger a defensive muscle spasm.
Completely defeating the purpose of the release.
Exactly. When you contact that taut rubber band sensation, you hold the position.
For how long?
The protocol dictates a strict 2 to 3 second sustained hold at that precise end range.
And this is where the mechanical restoration occurs.
Yes. The sustained pressure signals the deep mechanoreceptors embedded within the joint capsule to downregulate the chronic muscular guarding.
It incrementally unkinks the bony tunnel, allowing the artery space to decompress.
Correct.
Exercise 2 shifts the focus from the bone to the soft tissue. The SCM, the sternocleidomastoid release.
The SCM is a massive, incredibly powerful diagonal muscle group running from the mastoid process behind the ear, extending all the way down to anchor on the collarbone.
Okay.
Its primary evolutionary function is the heavy rotation and flexion of the human skull.
And when we spend our lives anchored to computer monitors and smartphones, that SCM becomes locked in a severely shortened, chronically contracted state.
Right.
It acts like an industrial tie-down strap, constantly compressing the entire cervical spine downward and crushing the vascular structures.
To release this immense muscular chokehold, the intervention requires leverage.
You must mechanically anchor the collarbone.
Yes. Place a flat, firm hand over your collarbone on one side and apply significant downward pressure. This pins the inferior attachment of the muscle.
Okay, got it.
With that anchor secured, slowly tilt your head toward the opposite shoulder and gently lift your chin slightly upward and away from the anchored side.
The hold time here is crucial, though. You hold that exact vector for 20 to 30 seconds. A quick stretch does nothing.
Nothing at all.
It takes sustained time for the neurological reflex within the muscle spindle to recognize that it is safe to release the contraction.
Right.
And then we conclude block 1 with 2 minutes of firm, deep, circular fingertip massage.
Originating at the base of the skull and tracking straight down to the base of the neck.
We are manually forcing local circulation and breaking up decades of fibrotic fascial adhesions.
However, releasing the mechanical restriction only solves half the equation.
Right.
You have successfully opened the vascular pathway. Oxygenated blood is finally surging back into the cerebellum.
But the cerebellar tissue has been operating in a state of severe starvation for years.
Exactly. The intricate neural pathways that manage balance and processing speed have physically degraded.
Which brings us to protocol block 2, forcing neuroplasticity. This is where the narrative shifts from damage control to active restoration.
The brain possesses the capacity to rebuild.
The balance you lost, the sharp memory retrieval, the rapid processing speed, that capacity is not permanently destroyed.
No, it's not. The cerebellum is arguably one of the most highly trainable neurological systems in the human body.
Through the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, we can force the adult brain to lay down entirely new neural wiring.
But there's a catch.
What is it?
The brain will only expend the massive energy required to build new pathways if we force it to adapt to precise, highly complex stimuli.
Exercise 1 in this neurological block is independent limb coordination. And on its face, it sounds like an incredibly cruel task to assign to someone who's already terrified of losing their balance.
The clinical instructions are intentionally demanding.
Okay, let's break it down.
The patient stands and initiates a continuous, deliberate rotation of their hips in a circular motion.
All right.
While maintaining that exact hip rotation, they must extend one leg and have it trace its own independent, asynchronous circular pattern on the floor.
Wow. And as if that dual tasking wasn't enough to overload the system, while the hips and leg are executing these distinct circular rhythms, the patient must raise their hands and tap out a completely independent, alternating rhythm in the air.
It is a meticulously orchestrated neurological overload.
Look, I have to challenge this from a practical standpoint.
Go ahead.
Why would a clinician ask a 65-year-old patient who is actively drifting into door frames and terrified of falling to attempt an exercise that is so profoundly awkward and confusing?
It's a fair question.
Won't they just fail, feel completely demoralized, and quit the protocol entirely?
It is a valid concern, but the methodology is biologically sound. That intense feeling of awkwardness, that overwhelming sensation where the patient thinks, I physically cannot make my brain coordinate these movements.
Right.
That sensation is not failure. That feeling of cognitive friction is the exact literal boundary of the patient's current neural wiring.
Wow. Okay.
When you push against that specific boundary, you create an acute biological demand.
So the brain has to respond.
Yes. The brain recognizes the failure to coordinate the limbs and immediately upregulates factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
To begin firing new synaptic connections to bridge the neurological gap.
Exactly. You are quite literally forcing the cerebellum to expand its processing power by giving it a problem it cannot currently solve.
That is fascinating. The final component, exercise 2, is the fixed point turn. This is a brilliant integration of classical vestibular rehab.
It really is.
The patient stands and locates a fixed point on the wall, strictly at eye level, a light switch, or a specific detail on a painting. They stare directly at it.
Right.
Then they execute a full, slow 360-degree rotation with their body.
And the critical constraint here is entirely visual. As the body rotates, the neck must remain turned so the eyes stay completely locked on that fixed point for as long as anatomically possible.
Okay.
When the neck physically reaches its absolute limit of rotation, the patient snaps their head around rapidly and immediately locks their eyes back onto the exact same point as the body finishes the rotation.
This raises an important question regarding sensory processing. What is actually happening inside the cerebellar circuits during that rapid snap of the head?
You are inducing a controlled collision of massive sensory data.
How so?
Your inner ear, the vestibular system, is screaming to the brain that you are spinning wildly through space.
Right.
Simultaneously, your visual system, which is locked onto a stable point, is transmitting data that you are stationary.
Oh, wow.
This creates a severe instantaneous conflict in sensory input.
So the brain has to sort it out.
Exactly.
Oh.
The cerebellum is forced to rapidly process this conflicting data, suppress the vestibular illusion of dizziness, and immediately stabilize your spatial orientation.
And by repeatedly exposing the cerebellum to this controlled stress, especially now that it finally has adequate blood flow from the mechanical release.
You are actively restoring the exact neurological filtering skill that eroded due to the initial vascular starvation.
That is brilliant. Let's look at the ultimate resolution of Robert, our civil engineer from Denver. He committed to the protocol. For 8 weeks, he meticulously performed the mechanical releases to unkink the vertebral arteries.
Right.
Then he integrated the coordination training to rebuild the neural pathways for an additional 2 weeks.
10 weeks total of active intervention.
And his leftward drift completely vanished. His wife noted that his ability to instantly recall proper nouns and complex names had fully returned.
That severe paralyzing 2.00 p.m. fatigue wall. It pushed back to a normal, physiological end-of-day tiredness at 9:00 p.m.
And in his own words, his brain felt like a blurry television broadcast that had finally been tuned back into high resolution.
That is the profound clinical power of addressing the mechanical root cause rather than merely masking the downstream symptoms with generalized medication.
Yeah. As we conclude this deep dive, we must confront the systemic indictment inherent in Dr. Brooks's research.
We have to.
He leaves us with a stark, unsettling reality regarding the modern healthcare apparatus. It is, by its very design and economic incentive structure, built to manage chronic decline.
Yes.
It is not built to resolve root mechanical causes.
It is a sobering reality to accept. A patient whose neurological symptoms are merely managed, perhaps prescribed a mobility aid for the drifting, or given an amphetamine derivative for the brain fog.
They become a permanent, managed fixture within the system.
They represent a continuous, reliable revenue stream.
Right.
But a patient who understands their own cervical hemodynamics, who actively resolves the mechanical restriction, and who successfully restores their own cerebellar blood flow.
That patient stops needing appointments.
They exit the system entirely.
This brings us to a grave call to action. If you find yourself grazing countertops as you walk through your kitchen,
If you are experiencing those terrifying micro-hesitations at doorways,
if you are drifting in parking lots or losing the second half of your sentences, Your brain is not just gracefully aging, it is actively, literally starving for oxygen.
You must take this mechanical protocol seriously.
You must perform these targeted releases and neurological exercises consistently, not once a week when your neck feels stiff, every single day.
Consistency is the only language that cellular neuroplasticity responds to.
So what does this all mean? It means we require a fundamental, radical shift in how we view longevity. We have to stop viewing ourselves as passive victims of an inevitable chronological decline and start operating as active engineers of our own cerebral blood flow.
You possess the mechanical power to unkink the line.
Exactly.
I will leave you with this final provocative thought to consider.
Please do.
We open this deep dive by discussing the comforting illusion of standard diagnostics, how desperately we want our medical issues to be visible, structural, and neatly categorized on an MRI scan.
Right.
But if years of subtle cognitive decline, evaporating memories, profound systemic fatigue, and physical instability can be traced back to something as mundane as the mechanical posture of our neck slowly choking off our brain's oxygen supply,
Yeah.
what other devastating, inevitable diseases of aging are we quietly accepting, simply because the medical establishment hasn't bothered to check the plumbing?